Today we will be discussing Angela Davis's An Autobiography. I'm Dr. Camille Alexander from Languages and Literature. With me on the panel is Dr. Frederick Kendrick from Media and Dr. Mohammed Al-Hamoumi from Cognitive Sciences.
Now her impact, it was not only in the United States, but she shaped many fields of science. I would talk about one. In 1968, she was really traumatized by the event, what happened around the world. First is the failure of the civil rights movement and the death of Martin Luther King. Second, by the May 68 and the student movement, which shaped the whole world, because they have almost 3 months paralyzed every activities around the world. Third is the Vietnam War. Now this articulates all this in her academic activities, action, and writing. She published a lot of articles and books. She created, her ideas shaped the field of psychology, what we called emancipatory psychology. This field only now in South Africa is not getting out. How psychology will participate to bring the human individual in with themselves.
I tend to reflect on her upbringing, her earlier childhood. When you look at the autobiography, there's all these things that affected her in her childhood in connection to what Dr. Hamoumi is saying. The two together created this person that wanted to see people liberated. And there's a passage that talks about the area of Birmingham where she grew up in. And every time a black family moved into a house in this neighborhood that's one street over, the house was bombed. And so it became known as Dynamite Hill,
yes,
because there were so many bombings happening every time that a black person moved into the neighborhood. I think that this uniquely affected who she became and how she felt about people. And then even later on, when she was in prison, when the FBI were looking for her, she even observed these particular roles in the prisons, how there was a familial setting and how people treated each other based on that. So I think she was uniquely affected by her childhood, but also by the writings of others, whether it be from the Communist Front or from Germany or whatever.
I know it's kind of a habit of those of us in literary studies to look at the autobiography as just a personal narrative. But Davis herself refers to her autobiography as a political autobiography. And I found that to be quite an interesting perspective because, you know, we think there's this big saying in the feminist movement that the personal is political. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. And in this particular autobiography, we have Davis focusing on the community she grew up in, the community that shaped her as a scholar and a future educator, and also the community that birthed this great activist that we know today. So it's quite a unique perspective presented in the text that maybe we're not seeing in the typical master narrative, white, male, Western autobiography. This particular one, like most African-American female autobiographies, is very political. It's not so much about the individual, but about the individual's contribution to the community. And I think this is what separates African-American communities in her time from maybe what we're seeing in communities around the world today. So we see quite a shift in this communal look at the world and a communal attitude to a very individualistic one.
I agree with that because when you, at the very beginning, based on what earlier you were saying, she says, I attempted to utilize the autobiographical genre to evaluate my life in accordance with what I considered to be the political significance of my experiences. The political manner of measurement emanated from my work as an activist in the Black movement and as a member of the Communist Party. So for me, she's saying, this is an autobiography, but it's also historical record of the time, what I see politically happening. And then later on, there's a passage where she talks about one of her friends. Early on, she says, Jonathan's body had lain on the hot asphalt of the parking lot outside the Marin County Civic Center. And when I read that, I immediately thought about Michael Brown.
Yes.
And to me, as a political statement, it's almost like, has anything changed? Or has nothing changed? She's, you know, several decades ago, she's talking about black people being slain in public and their body laying there in the street for hours and no one doing anything about it. Well, we just saw that with Michael Brown. And so this also speaks to where we are politically as a people, where we are as a society. Have we changed? Has anything changed?
Yeah, it's very interesting to actually read her, the latest interviews, because she did me interview. And she was really, autobiography, in my view, is the hard topic of psychology, because the individual is the higher form of the social. That means she integrates all these movements, all these historical changes. Now for her, she said, now we are living in a new world, a lot of changes. And still that's because the golden age again of her 20s, but the 60s, that's what a person who didn't study what happened between the scientific production in social sciences and the other field, 1960 to 1970, have no place in the academia. Now she said, okay, we must focus on the consciousness. If we arrive to that level and emancipation, but the concept of emancipation is a very powerful concept. Nobody wants this concept to be addressed in social sciences.
No, they don't. And I think she touches on that almost in every facet of society. Because when she's in the prison, she sees how women are treated in a certain way. For example, let's put this one in the ward for those that have mental problems. And that's how we suppress the political activism. Okay, we take you out of that, now we put you in an area that's rat infested. Okay, and we take you away from that, now we remove books or the library from you. So in throughout her life, here she's fighting for prison reform, she's fighting for gender reform within the prisons, and then she reflects on how the FBI treats people, you know, the trickery that goes on. You know, there's a law that governs how they have to deal with you, but I'm not going to allow you to talk to your lawyer. You know, and do we see that today? Absolutely, you know.
Well, you know, even in the prison, you know, they did some experiments in the brain of these prisoners. But electrical shock, see, they did some parts in the brain where violence is, this went to locate violence inside the brain. And they conduct many experiments, mutilate the people, abuse them by scholars, scientists. It happened this. And she witnessed it. That's what she struggling for, a new climate, a new environment for the prison.
It also demonstrates her ingenuity in having to even smuggle these books in through other people and distribute it. And as she's distributing these books in the prison, you see the consciousness of the women in the prison change too.
Yeah. Well, at first you see a sort of gender warfare happening in the prison because these are women and there's a need to keep them ignorant.
Yes.
And also docile.
Yeah.
So they're taking the books away, but what are they replacing the books with? Mind-altering drugs.
Yeah.
So they're giving the prisoners drugs. So first they're isolating them, you know, because they're quote-unquote crazy, which we know is a popular label to use with women. Anytime a woman steps outside of the boundaries of human society, she immediately becomes quote-unquote crazy. And then of course, because she is crazy, she has to be medicated. And medicated becomes another form of gender control that is no different from what the health people were doing in the late 19th century, giving women the so-called wellness cure.
Yes.
So then, okay, that doesn't work. You're not exactly docile yet. You refuse to take the drugs. So we're going to put you in a rat-infested room. Now we're going to flood your room so that you cannot possibly get comfortable at night. So you see Angela Davis going through these different experiences, and what would break the normal human being, she manages to turn it into a teachable moment for the other women She's reaching out in a communal way to help these other women just survive in this setting. And this setting is quite punitive. Forget about the fact that they've been arrested for various trumped up crimes. Take that off the table. It's quite a punitive setting with several demonstrations of human rights abuses.
Yes.
And here you have this female Black American activist who's saying, no, this is not how it's going to go. And she's not losing her temper or engaging in any kind of discussions with the people in the prison. She's just standing up for herself. And in the process, you see this wonderful example of how it spreads to all of the other prisoners. Once she takes a stand, this one person, it's almost like everybody else is forced into a position where they have to take a stand. They can't let things continue. And I think this is a wonderful example of how female communities can thrive.
She articulated that in the text when she was explaining how divided everyone was, and all of these processes you talk about were put in place to divide people, each prisoner individually. But then when they started to come together, as you said, she started to articulate the familial setting that she saw in the prisons, where there was a mother and a father and a family, and that's where the strength was. And then she had this aha moment where she's like, what could they do for themselves if they pushed for reforms, whether it be on the library, whether it be with the food, because several nights she had food that had roaches scrambling around it and things. All of these things would have been beneficial to improving their lives if they took the idea and the notion of unity, of working together. And she also articulated, which I found very interesting, is that at that particular time, there was no really concern about nationality. She talks about Puerto Ricans being in the prison with her, blacks, whites, everyone working together.
They haven't figured out today what Angela Davis and her compatriots figured out 50 years ago. There's strength and power in numbers. When we divide up into little subgroups, not only is it an ineffective method for combating patriarchy and hegemony, it's just politically foolish. You know, there is something about groups of people uniting and saying we have a common cause and staying together under the umbrella of that common cause rather than separating off and worrying about all of the differences we have. And I think if you look at the US as a microcosm, or even England, you'll see that the separating off has not done anyone any good.
Well, the separation is designed to hold people in place. And she mentioned that, I love this line, she says, jails and prisons are designed to break human beings, to convert the population to specimens in a zoo, obedient to our keepers, but dangerous to each other. Yes. And, you know, I'm like, wow, when I hear that, because that's exactly what you see in society. If I can divide you and have you, the three of us attacking each other, then there's someone up top playing puppet master who is keeping us in our place, in our cage.
Yes.
And she's saying that when you're in that cage, you should come together on a defined goal and purpose, and that's how you get out of the cage and you define your own box and your own reality. And so early on, she figured this out just by sitting in the prison. It's like, when you see her, you know she's a true academic when you see these writings, because she became an ethnographer while she's in prison.
Yes.
She just sat there and observed the situation and was able to explain, this is what they're doing to keep us in a particular position. I think the beauty of the Black Panther movement for her was organization.
Yes.
And she talked earlier about how living in Birmingham, she says there was no extensive organized movement at the time when she was in Birmingham. And she even reflected on looking back in Montgomery and what was going on with Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. And she said it was not synonymous at the time in Birmingham, it was not. And so when I look at that, I think that's part of the attraction to the Black Panther movement, is that she wanted to be active in something that was going to be progressive for her people and for society in general. When she ventured off to New York for her studies, she talks about how she wanted to go back to Birmingham. She felt like they're just now moving and doing something now when I'm here. And she felt almost like a slight void because she wasn't able to go help out in the marches. But her parents said, no, stay where you are in New York.
Because she was looking for a theory.
Very calculating.
She was looking for the theory, it was Frantz Fanon. When she discovered the theory, she articulates between the two. The Black Panther are well trained. You know, they are trained really, particularly in the war, radicalized in Korean War. They came well equipped. But the action, they need theory to guide it. That's what they bring the consciousness again and start the movements. In this. The Black Panther was really heavily influenced when they meet Fanon.
Well, this is not
This
unusual.
is in 1960. They meet him in Algeria. At that time, it was explosion everywhere. And this what lead really the Black Panthers in the United States to take action. And now they are guided by theory.
Well, that actually makes sense because most of the leaders of the Black Panther Party were college educated. The
Yes.
majority
Yeah,
of them
yeah.
had PhDs. So the fact that they were guided by the theories of Fanon it just makes perfect sense. Back then, if you were in the Western Hemisphere, you had two choices and two theoreticians rather to follow.
Yeah.
Frantz Fanon or Aimé Césaire.
Yes.
Those were your two choices. Well, I'm also fascinated by the fact that as a member of the Black Panther Party, Angela Davis employs some of the techniques that had been common among African American women in previous centuries, organizing, back to this idea of organization. One thing that we can credit, well, we could credit the Black Panther Party with quite a lot, let me not misspeak, but we can certainly credit them with being one of the most highly organized organizations of the latter half of the 20th century, particularly in the 1960s. And we can never deny this. They were able to organize themselves, then commune with La Raza, also with the American Indian Movement, AIM. So and the SNCC,
Yes.
Student for Nonviolent Committee. So you have several different groups working together in highly organized mechanisms, having protests in multiple cities at the same time. And within the Black Panther Party, the fact that Angela Davis and, by the way, Elaine Brown, who was involved in that movement in Algeria, having these women at the top of the party was quite a coup even back then, because women just didn't get to the top of organizations. It didn't happen. You could be a secretary, but you couldn't be a president.
Well, when you think about that too, I mean, in retrospect, one could argue that was probably one of the mistakes of the FBI when arresting her, because you arrested someone so high profile.
Yes.
And she talks about when she's in prison, how she heard this chanting outside. And the people had to tell her, that's for you.
Yeah.
They're outside protesting, and they've been here every night protesting. They might have been more effective had they chosen another person to go after.
This is true. Arresting her, you're right, it was extremely short-sighted, very foolish, and, you know, well, these things happen, but...
Well, she even talks about how she's on the run, putting together her own disguises.
It's so organized.
So they made her into a celebrity where everyone's looking for this woman with this afro, and she's putting on disguises to avoid detection. Well, after they arrest her, of course, they take the disguises off and they walk her out of the lobby of the hotel, and it's highly orchestrated. They've got all the cameras there taking pictures of her. What did that do for the movement? You know, it's almost like you...
It was free publicity, you know, and free publicity for her as well.
I think a normal person would have broken down to have this figure always there in the background trying to paint you and articulate and say that you are something that you're not. And you all know that my roots are in the state of Alabama. Well, some of the things he did prevail to today. You know, just earlier this year, she was offered an award by the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. And the award is the Reverend Shuttlesworth Award. And they offered her to come in, do a lecture, and receive the award. And then there were some protests from people from a particular organization, and they said, okay, no, we're going to rescind our offer and not give you the award. And as you read the commentary in the newspapers about why people were protesting, it all goes back to them saying she was wanted by the FBI, she's a cop killer, she's this, she's that, she's this. All this stuff originated with Reagan. So she's dealing with the residuals even now.
What this brings us really, she was really criticized by the right and by the left, the two. because she very smart. She know how to navigate. You know, she was rewarded the biggest prize from Russia at that time. And they accused her of many things. But she was developing strategies to overcome all these issues.
Yes.
She got above because she was equipped by really academically highest mind. She know how to navigate in academia and to overcome the critics coming from the left and from the right. Well, really her legacy, first for the feminism. She developed the really, now you go any university, particularly in the United States or Europe, they have feminist studies,
yes.
feminist psychology, feminist sociology, all the fields. They went to open, first time, women, they have eyes, they have brains. We don't know. She was struggling against the masculine knowledge, the Cartesian epistemology. Women, we don't know around the world. That's what she was struggling. She said, I am here. I see the world differently than the hegemony of the masculine epistemology. That's what because she was educated in the Eurocentrism, in all these grand theories from Descartes to now, to the Greek and so on. But she said there is another contribution, what we call the Afrocentrism. That was neglected. And that's what led really to the 3 volumes, or in the internet. I wish the students can read them. Black Athena, Volume 1, Volume 2, Volume 3.
Yes.
Very powerful. And she meets Martin Bernal. He's British and white. And the others in academia. Why you want to crush the whole civilization based on men, the white men? Now you create a problem for us. You want to raise the consciousness of women and to add the contribution of the Afrocentrism.
There's so many aspects of society that she was able to touch upon, or is able, I don't want to say was.
Yes, not
passive,
was yet.
is able
Please.
to touch upon.
Is.
What her struggle to bring the person with him or herself. Like for feminism, said, a woman, come to yourself.
Yes.
Don't be outside.
It's
Come
not
to
about,
yourself.
It's not about so much disrupting the external order. You have to start with the internal.
Yes.
The struggle begins within, and then you can transfer it to without, which is, I think, what Angela Davis has done her entire life, fighting internally, which we can read in the pages of her autobiography, and then taking it out into the street. Praxis.
Praxis, yes.
So,
Well, when you talk about on the streets, I mean, even the vocality, the vocalness of who she was. You're talking about a time where even then, does a woman say these things? Can a woman say these
well,
things?
of course not. Can a woman say them today?
You know, it's a very interesting subject because, you know, you look at, you read the autobiography and then you look at the images. Here's this woman in front of the camera challenging the entire judicial structure.
Yes.
And everything that the FBI is doing. And the FBI is a completely male-dominated, white-dominated society at that time and largely much today. So she's challenging the white male figure, which represents the establishment, that has wrongly, falsely accused her, and she stares them in the eye and says, I will not be downtrodden. You will not do this. And it's very interesting how she navigated that.